Welcome to Full Metal RPG. I'm Richie Buzzkill, and tonight we're feeling like maybe yelling at some clouds or saying some people should get off our lawn. At least specifically, my friend Noland here has brought us a topic. Say hello, Noland.
Hello, Noland.
Exactly. And Kayla is also here with us.
Hi, everyone.
We're going to have a little introduction from Noland. This is his subject. I have some thoughts because we've been talking about it, but go ahead, Noland. Please introduce the subject.
All right, so rant time. Long ago, D&D was kind of a weird mishmash of every fantasy, sci-fi, weird fiction nonsense anybody could think of. And, that was kind of wild and crazy. And over the years, it kind of calcified and there were certain genre expectations of D&D that didn't really match with any like fantasy thing in particular, but it was kind of more of its own thing. And way back when, everybody had their own homebrew world, and there were, of course, then later different interesting campaign settings: Dark Sun, Ravenloft, Forgotten Realms, etc. But there were some sprinkled throughout. There were some hints about a kind of assumed setting, right? There was magic items named after particular characters, or spells named after particular characters, right? So you had a little sense of something there. But I feel like recently the whole thing has begun to like calcify into like real, like assumed D&D lore. Like if I have a D&D campaign, are people coming to my world expecting there to be a Vecna? Does there need to be a Feywild attached to my world? Is like Tiandra the Summer Queen there, right? Is there a Nine Hells and Orcus running around there, right? And of course, even the main books like, Tasha and Xanathar and all these kind of things, are these characters and these things like now assumed by players coming to D&D that I have these things in my home campaign? Is the main question there. Like to what level is Wizards and kind of the D&D content industrial complex creating this kind of more solid lore? Long ago, the White Wolf folks had, very elaborate lore for every city, right? And people would memorize it. Are we moving towards that in the D&D world?
That's right, everybody. It's a classic Full Metal RPG. It's been nearly 8-9 years, and we're still complaining about D&D topic. Yeah, this is it. Well, and my question will be in the end: is this really a problem? But we'll get to that.
Why do I care? Yes, that's a good question.
Why do you care about this? Kayla, being the person that sees the most new people, runs the most new people through D&D through her practice. Have you seen people expecting certain things when they come to the table to your table?
So that's a complicated question because I work with a lot of neurodiverse folks. And so some are just coming to the table for the first time and have no idea how to D&D. Like they've never touched dice, they don't understand like what's going on. And then I have some that are very, very rigid mindset and get very stuck in the lore, and this is what it should look like. And that can be really challenging for them because I, as a game master, almost entirely throw D&D lore out the window. We don't use a lot of D&D lore in my sessions, so down to like monster stat blocks, I almost always modify or manipulate them to best fit my purposes. I legitimately just had some struggles with someone around this previous weekend. One of my kiddos was really upset because some of my NPCs were bugbears and goblins who were good, And he's like, no, they are evil. They are evil. What are you doing? I was like,
Oh boy, did we accidentally trip into orcs are always evil territory again?
we
Oh,
did.
oh boy.
We did.
Did we do this again? Oh, well, let's not talk about we've done that subject a few times. Let's move on from there. But
So yeah, I think that I think it depends on the person that I see, but I would say 9 times out of 10 the kiddos don't care. Like they're here to tell a good story. They don't care about the lore necessarily. Some of them are deep in the lore and very connected, but others are willing to roll with where I put them because they've created the worlds that we play in. So we don't have a lot of ties to D&D lore. We have ties to the lore that they came up with. And while we can acknowledge that D&D, when we're talking above table and out of game, D&D has these characters that are common, right? They have the Sword Coast and the things that go on in the Sword Coast and the typical, I guess, cast of characters or the typical sites that you might see. I don't know that most of the kids necessarily come in with that. Now, I think that that's an area they could potentially grow into, with getting deep into D&D lore, because there's about 1 billion books that you can read to get you into D&D lore. But I think that when they start with me, they're starting from a place of I throw the rule book out a lot. We're there to tell good stories for you to have a basic understanding of how to run a D&D character, to be able to jump into a game at a friendly local game store outside of a therapy group and be okay, and just know that the game master is probably going to run things different than what I do.
yeah, I mean, I can see this as sort of like in other games that are like Star Wars and anything that's based on IP, there is an assumed kind of lore, and you kind of maybe have to pick and choose, like especially with Star Wars, like, oh, well, if you actually encounter Vader other than in passing, you've done screwed up. You're probably going to have a very bad time, you and your friends, or maybe you don't. That, beating the big bad of the campaign, great. But our friend Jake is running has been running a D&D game with, and he had somebody that was so into the monster manual that they had memorized all of the stats of the monsters. So he just started changing the stats for all the monsters, which is, upsetting expectations, but I think it's making it more fun for the table. But it's a balancing act, right? There's some things that people just really want to, they want to see the thing, they want to meet the people. And with things like shows like Stranger Things and other various, the whole D&D movie, right? You look at the D&D movie, you're like, oh, I want to play D&D. Well, you can't actually be a druid that actually changes into an owlbear. Why? Well, because that's what the rules say, but you could do it anyways because it's your table.
Yet. They are rumored to be changing that rule, but I agree.
We're recording this in spring of 2024 before D&D 2024 comes out in September, from what I understand. Anyways.
Yep. That was one of the pre-release things, is you can flavor text it however you want, but it looks like this. And I'm like, why do we need a rule for that? I'm gonna let my kiddos flavor text to whatever. If they're changing into an owlbear, they're gonna be like a young owlbear. They're not gonna be a strong one unless they're nobody at my table is level 20. But if you're level 20, I'll let you turn into whatever you want. Sure. Why not?
Well, I mean, it's like, that's very much the Savage Worlds approach to powers. Just this is my lightning power. It looks the same as my fire power, but it says lightning and it does lightning stuff. Mm-hmm. But if D&D is going that direction, hooray, a victory for Zim. Like, but to Nolan's point of like, are you are people, when they sit down at a game to learn, play a game, are they expecting, Vecna to show up and be a bad guy and or have the classic joke of, oh, I need to replace my head with the head of Vecna.
You're running very, very close to one of my personal favorite soapboxes, which is session 0. Like, this is why session 0 is important, right? Let's set the expectations. What are your players opting in for or expecting as you sit down at this table? If my players are coming to sit down at this table and they're expecting only D&D lore, rules as written, and that's all we're going to be, then they are at the wrong table. Like, they need to go somewhere else, because that's not how I'm going to play.
Well, I think this even goes to session -1, aka the email or the soft sell you're using to get somebody to the table, is telling them, hey, I'm playing it this way. This is going to be my fun, because that's, and I understand Nolan's anxiety about this, because as somebody that runs games at conventions and stuff like that, having people like sit down at your table. No, I'm not going to be running D&D at it, but I can understand, like, this is how I'm running it. Unless I'm running for Adventure League, where I need to be inside of an enclosed suitcase of a games of everybody's playing in the same world, then I'm going to say we are going to sit down and play this game the way everyone's going to have fun with it. And if this is not your kind of fun, then maybe you shouldn't play it. But
yeah, and that's kind of, this is secretly, kind of about my preferences, right? Like, one of my favorite parts of the DM role is the kind of world building stuff. And I've always, kind of, resented the lore in Vampire and a lot of these other games, and I don't play a lot of like licensed games, so sometimes I do. But unless the lore is bringing something very specific, right, I like to build my own, right? I like to have my own history of where the vampires came from or who the elders are and blah blah blah, and then and that's really the problem, right? Is as the GM, right, that's one of my favorite things. And when I do that, I'm then fighting player expectations, which is, okay, like, we can have a session 0 and I can, explain to you what it is. But then on the other hand, I think having this official lore is bad, because then my most engaged players, the people that most are there to play D&D, have like put all the time into like learning the lore and becoming lore masters and all this. They're disappointed that I'm doing world building too. So like, now I, as the GM, am having trouble because I'm fighting their expectations and they're having trouble. And like, the fact that this quote unquote official lore exists, right, makes both of us unhappy. And I'm like, I wish it didn't exist. And I shake my tiny fists at the situation, right?
I do think that's setting up your expectations is going to be one of those important steps. But I mean, I played a lot of Vampire, and I have never felt like, because it's more grounded, I've never felt like the lore actually made it more difficult to run, because
I've definitely sat at a table and someone's like, but no, this is not canonically a Camarilla city you're setting this thing in. Why is the Camarilla in charge here? Like, oh, for fuck's sake. Like,
well, and yes, those people do exist. And actually, I think, getting onto a tangent, but 5e Vampire has figured out a somewhat of a way of solving this, in the fact that, like, you know what you know, but your character knows what your character knows, and you can have backgrounds or knowledge in you have knowledge in these specific areas. Would you like to spend points in knowing about the Church of Cain? Fine, spend points. But otherwise,
I did like that.
This, and also, this is my fact sheet for the the Church of Cain for what you know. Here you go. So you can literally systematize it if you really want to. But going back to D&D, it's such a pastiche of a game, right? Because you just look at Appendix N and all the influences there. If you just take Appendix N and you get closer to DCC than you do with modern D&D, but even DCC is like full of cross wires. It's like, oh, it's this and this, and they're both true, and you'll just have to deal with it. Like, so unreliable narrators are your friend in this particular instance.
I actually do want to shout out the OSR. Like, I think they're doing a fantastic job keeping it weird and eclectic, and like no assumed no assumed lore. I think they're doing a great job. And you're absolutely right. Like, D&D's always had weird eclectic nonsense, but it didn't have really much in the way of official lore for a long time, even until second edition, right? It really started getting more official lore. You got those orange spine books, I guess. But I prefer that kind of, what the indie people would call like the fruitful void, right? Here's kind of some edges around what D&D might be like, these Appendix N things, these weird spells, but like, it's not defined how magic works in your campaign, just that these spells are kind of broadly available. It's not defined, what the gods are, how much they intervene in the world, but like, here's how a cleric works, right? You get some like guidance on what your world should look like, but there's a whole bunch of fruitful void in there, so you can have, a quest for this artifact created by the gods who created the world in your world, or maybe the gods didn't create the world in your world, or what. However it works, right? That was always a lot of the fun of sticking that nonsense in there, right? Some people's worlds were like post-apocalyptic. There had been a highly advanced technological civilization, and now it's back to medieval weirdness, right?
Well,
everybody did their own thing, right?
I mean, back when we were playing second edition, and even I feel like even in third, people would, they would sit down and create their own world, and they would pick and choose what they wanted from all the different sources they had, and that was what you played with. But I understand. I mean, I can sort of understand that, like, we're much more promiscuous on what tables we actually visit nowadays.
Mm-hmm.
There's a lot more, pickup game, people just going on the internet and just playing on Roll20. I mean, there's whole forums of people like, oh, I'll just play in your game. And that I can understand, like, if you're playing a high level character, and I've gotten into this before, like, and you don't know anything about the world, like you just start out as a 6th level character and you roll into a world and you're like, so I'm fairly powerful, but what the hell am I supposed to be doing here, right? And that's maybe why some of this calcification can be a good thing, is you can kind of jump into a game and be like relatively versant in what's going on after someone gives you a 5-minute primer instead of, here, read this stack of books.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think that's the major benefit, right? Is that if there is some assumed lore, that's guide rails for, there's more of an official setting. That's guide rails for new GMs, right? I don't know. I don't know if Kayla's seen anybody, take up the GM mantle. Does that help them, right? Or
again, so I come from, Tyler has ran historically just the pre-built campaigns. So I've played in pre-built campaigns, but I'm not sure that the lore has ever fully gotten in the way of anything, or like knowledge of, or lack of knowledge from a player standpoint has gotten in the way of that. I do think that it's kind of fun to like have your group's kind of canonical view of what the yawning portal looks like and how that interacts. And for anyone that has played through the modules, like what Durnan is like, and that ended up being one of our like big NPCs from 2 campaigns, because we were endeared to him during 1 campaign, and then that like feeling didn't go away from the player's perspective. So we were endeared to him as different characters, basically, just because of the history there. So I think that there's some fun things that you can get to tie in as like players. From a DM side of things, I've never ran an actual adventure module before, so I'm not a great person to ask there. I'm very like tie-dye hippie when it comes to these D&D things, right? Like we're very far from D&D lore in a couple of my campaigns. Um Mainly because the storyline in the back, the like lore that happened in our setup of this is that there are like dimension rifts happening, and so the players are working to solve the dimension rifts, and 2 campaigns they've fallen into these dimension rifts. And what that looks like is I have one that's currently in a cyberpunk world we're playing D&D, but they're in cyberpunk land. And we've got another one that's in the Wild West, basically. There's guns. They've like robbed a gun because that's what you do, as players, and especially as preteens. So we've got middle schoolers who are like, guns, D&D and guns, yes. I'm like, the bad news for you is you don't know how to shoot it because you've never seen this. You don't know how to load it. And if it jams, you are in trouble. But sure, you can have a gun for now. I don't know where you're going to get ammunition, but I'm very much so roll with the flow. And I think that like that's a challenge for DMs that are not following the canon, right? Or not following the lore that's kind of presented, is you kind of have to be open to the improv. You have to be open to asking your players, well, what rumors have you heard about town? And allowing that to kind of shape the lore and the story as you go, presenting those opportunities. Because it would be very difficult for me to come up with all of the lore that's happening for every single homebrew campaign. But I have players who have creative minds and who get bought into a story if they get to contribute to the lore that exists. It's like, well, my character heard that there are some dragons that make the most amazing weapons, but these they don't sell them. You have to earn them through trials, and no one knows what trials you have to go through. Cool. If you're creative and I like the idea, I'm gonna like, that's not lore, that's true. I don't know if you're gonna find those dragons, but there's absolutely some dragons in their human form running around creating magic weapons that you have to do weird, ridiculous tasks to earn. And I guess just like being more flexible in that vein helps if you don't already have pre-established lore.
Right. Well, I think the concern of our good friend Noland is that we have this that as 5e has gone on, that you get more and more books, and people have this like expectation that comes in, and I mean, I'm sure there are people that are like that, but like, do you really want to play with them? But it's I think it's going to cycle back around again, because while they're going to try and make this edition last longer and have a 5.5 because they had such a rejection of the 1 D&D license. It seems like what the direction they've decided to go with, other than firing all of their staff that designed the game, most of them anyways. So we have this like continued, march of different books that are, and Tasha and Mordenkainen's and all these other books kind of adding to this lore. But a lot of these books, like, you look at them and they're like, oh, well, this is like some examples, and this is how to build things.
Right.
So I don't necessarily see it as like, I sort of can see the Marvel problem, because the Marvel problem is that you have established all this lore, and then where do you go from there? And this happens in a lot of IPs as things go on. Is you're like, well, shit, we're right out of ideas, and everything that we come up new is flopping. Well, let's reboot. Let us reboot and go to a new version, or have a Final Crisis, or what was the thing at the end of second edition where they're like, we're blowing up second edition though, or we're blowing up Vampire second edition. Like, they always have these end of world events, and then as time goes on, we get this like coming back around where they start over again, and this time it's slightly different.
Right. And I think that's a good point. Like, if I thought this kind of, thing was organic, where the fans just really liked, some of these characters from these adventure modules, and, then the designers and writers like bring them back in later editions, and like then people like Vecna kind of become like official canon, that not tied to any like game world, right? Then I think I would be okay. But like, I honestly think it is coming from, like you said, an intellectual property kind of point of view, right? I got triggered by this when, of course, my YouTube feed is garbage and feeds me all kinds of D&D lore things, and people telling me all about how this is exactly how all this happened. Like, is it exactly how all these things happened, right? I don't know that to be true in my world, right? And they're setting these expectations. And I think, Wizards is interested in these kind of recurring characters, right? As they get into movies, as they, cross license with everything. I think they don't mind this kind of calcification of the thing, because it gives them a better like intellectual property thing, a kind of, thing to build a fan base around that isn't even necessarily play D&D, right? That just is engaged with the media, right, around D&D.
Well, the biggest player base is Baldur's Gate 3. It's
Right.
not the tabletop game. It's the video game. Like, there are more people logging more hours on that every day than there are people actually playing the tabletop game. So,
Right.
But I think that there is a conversion rate there, which is a good thing for the community and for Wizards. But there is probably some of those people that go, well, how come there's no sex moves in
Right.
D&D? Because I have sex moves in Baldur's Gate. So, anyways, that's that's a Apocalypse World joke, everybody. Anyways, so I think that we have to kind of be on the lookout for this stuff, but I also think that like algorithms are going to try and feed us this as an IP, because that's what algorithms love, is something that you can keep repeatedly doing the thing that the algorithm wants you to do by going, oh, well, I clearly want to hear the entire tale of Tiamat. No, not the original Babylonian Tiamat, but the D&D Tiamat, right? I want to,
Right.
there's something to be said about the way that we are being spoon-fed information out, in our electronic forms. That is something to be watched out for. And that's the reason we have communities that are sort of like they're cells now, as opposed to this like ebbing and flowing of different play types. And because like there's the OSR, there's the D&D, there's the White Wolf people, there's all that we sort of had come together again when we had the downturn in the market, and then as the algorithms have started to work, I do see there is kind of this compartmentalization of the community, and these sort of lore things help keep the electronic overlords keep pushing us in a direction. So I don't know.
I will say, like, I think that I could go either way with this, but where I'm not going to be able to like support or go is when the lore gets in the way of telling a good story. And like if it's going to be additive, awesome. If people want to pull from the lore and add that or even flavor text it over from the lore that they know into the story that we're telling in a way that makes sense, in a way that we can incorporate in the story, I'm here for it. But if it gets in the way of us telling a good story, or players can't separate player knowledge from character knowledge, which is really when I get frustrated as a player and as a DM, right? Uh well, this and this and this, and it's like you know this as a player, cool, but you don't know this as your character would have no reason to know this. I might give you a history roll to see if your character for some reason knows this, but you can't just assume that your character has this knowledge that you are coming to the table with. And that can get in the way of us telling a story that makes sense for character growth when you come in with all of the information. And one of the way I haven't actually ran into this as much with D&D, but I did run into like maybe not the most fun playthrough when I played through Old Gods of Appalachia, because I've never listened to the full podcast. I've listened to an episode or two, but some of the players at the table were diehard. They knew everything. They had the full lore. They were up on the current thing. And so when we're hitting those points in the role play about specific characters, I'm like, this is in my backstory. I don't know what this is. I'm happy to make it up if you don't want to tell me or go into the lore, but I need the DM or the GM to make a decision on what we're doing with this. And that got really clunky with the mix of characters and then people being very attached to their understanding of what was going on versus I sat down to play because I'm like, I have listened a couple of times, but I really like the idea of uh the things going on in the system in general. So I'm here to tell a fun story within that system, not necessarily retell a story that's been told on a podcast.
Yeah,
Ru-
Kayla makes a good point there that like the lore does cut two ways, right? If you're a GM that's like, oh my gosh, I have a blank page and I have to create a world for myself, and I'm not the kind of person like Noland who's like super into world building. I don't like that. Like having that official lore down in the book is probably a huge, weight off your shoulders as a GM if you're not into that. But it cuts the other way from the player. Like Kayla was saying, she sat down at the table and like, I don't know the lore. I feel kind of incompetent around the GM and these other players who are super into it. Like, so it sets up a barrier to players instead of a barrier to GMs, right? So it can cut both ways, right?
right. And I think that especially for one shots, that's particularly difficult to deal with. In a campaign, it's one thing, but I do think that that was that a demo game of Old Gods?
Yeah, it was I think a 4-hour session, like a 4-hour one shot of Old Gods. So
Right. To me, I mean, and I haven't just like listening to I think one episode of that, which it was really fantastic, and I would listen to more of it. But it's it seems like it'd almost be better if you didn't know any of that shit to like play in that world, to be those characters, so you can be surprised and have the. But I understand it as a fan of Star Wars, like be like, oh shit, I know who that is. Oh crap, we're in deep trouble. Being kind of a thing for the player and not the character. Like the character has no idea. But yeah, you're right. You having that separation between player and character is difficult for some people, and I think that's something you kind of have to like work into, right? As you start to play a game, most people tend to play themselves to start with, not even putting uh, uh, any kind of barriers between them and the character. So then you have to kind of learn. I think that's a learned response. That's a more so not knowing the world is great when you don't need it. But if that's the game, like there is a style of play with OSR, some of the people who play OSR are like, no, it's all about player knowledge, and your characters are under your control, but you are there to face off against the kind of the thing you're being tossed into from the game master, and you're trying to. So there's different play styles, and you kind of have to find the right group, as we've always said. But you know, sometimes when you have a one shot like that's, you're like, oh, I signed up for 4 hours of this. Well, like I said, I think that in some ways this is very helpful. In other ways, it's not. So I'm pretty neutral on the idea. I mean, that's really kind of my statement for this. But
Yep. If I get to wrap up here, my piece is like, yeah, keep your D&D weird. Don't fall in the line. Keep your D&D weird. It's more fun that way.
No, I think that like my only final thought is just play the game that you want to play, find people that want to play it the same way with you, and if you can't, come to a compromise and just kind of agree on the things you want to do, lore or not, rules as written or not. Like I think that you can just, as long as you guys are getting together, having fun and telling a good story, that's really my version of the perfect role play is, are we having fun as a group? Are we telling a fun story that I'm into? I don't really necessarily care what the rules or the established lore is. And Noland has said this differently several times, but I am very much so the system doesn't necessarily matter to me. Like, I don't care as long as we can tell a fun story and that the system is somewhat established so that it makes somewhat sense.
fair enough. All right. Well, thanks everybody, and I want to especially thank the patrons. You are what keep us going, and I really appreciate your patience. So, but if you go to homelrpg.com, and there is a link to our Patreon on there, as well as other things, including the merch store that we have is going away. I've got a couple new designs in my back pocket, but I'm going to do them completely different. So if you like any of the designs that we have put out over the years or seen on the show or whatever, just go take a look at that merch store, and it's going away. So all those designs are going in the bin, or behind into the vault once more. And we'll have some new designs in a different way. Well, thanks everybody. Have a good night.